So here we're going to construct the undercollar. Okay, so you should have two pieces, half-inch seam allowance at center back, and they should be cut on bias. So here's the hair canvas, it's cut on bias. We're going to mark the seam allowance exactly at a ½ inch. Because like we've done with the other interfacing, we're going to overlap it exactly on the stitching line and stitch it together. So once you've marked it, overlap it. To make it easier on yourself, mark both sides of the canvas, the ½ inch, or the stitching line mark. It will make it easier to line up. Once you've marked it, line it up and pin it together. Once it's pinned together, go ahead and do a running basting stitch through it. Again, this will hold it together and make it easier to stitch. Okay, now it's been basted together. I can take the pins out. Now take the wool as well, undercollar, and we're going to stitch that together too. Your wool undercollar should have ½ inch seam allowance, and it should be cut on the bias. So be careful stitching this together because we're not stay stitching any of it yet. So be careful not to stretch it because it can stretch very easily. Make sure the back tack at the beginning and end. Okay, once that's stitched together, go ahead and stitch together your hair canvas as well. This you can do a zigzag or a straight stitch. I'm going to do a zigzag. And make sure you stitch it right on the seam allowance or the stitching line that you've overlapped. Okay, once you've stitched that together, go ahead and trim back the seam allowance that you've overlapped to a ½ inch on both sides to reduce that bulk. And on the wool undercollar, press that seam allowance open. Remember to be careful because you haven't stay stitched anything, so you can easily stretch this because it's cut on bias. Alright, now that it's pressed open, I'm going to trim the seam allowance back to a ½ on each side, okay? And that will reduce a little bit of bulk in there. Be careful not to cut too much away. I wouldn't do, if you're a ½ inch, I'd only trim away a ½ There we are. Now, the seam allowance of your wool collar facing up, lay your hair canvas on top, lining up the center backs. Okay, and then pin it on. You can just pin around the outer edges to get it all pinned together. Once you finish pinning the two together around the edges, go ahead and do a diagonal basting stitch. And you're going to do these stitches perpendicular to the collar. So you can see here I'll need to do, quite a few rows to keep them securely together. So on this collar, I'll probably end up doing about 4 to 5 rows. Alright, once it's all basted together, what we're going to do is we need to mark the roll line. So take your patterns, just like we did on the jacket front lapel, lay them on, line them up, and pin them in place. Here I'm making sure the center back of my pattern lines up with the center back of my zone collar, and I'm just going to pin it so it stays in place. And now I'll put pins right through my roll line. Okay, so I'm pinning through all layers, and I'm pinning right through my roll line, parallel with my roll line, just like I did on the roll line of the lapel in the front of the jacket, to mark where my roll line is. So make sure you have enough pins going through to accurately mark it. And now I can take a colored pencil and I can mark right underneath the pin on the hair canvas side, okay? Because I want to mark exactly where that roll line is. And now I can take the pins out and I can take the pattern off as well. And I'm going to do the exact same thing on the other side. So don't forget that my collar here is asymmetrical. I believe everyone else in class has a symmetrical collar. So don't get confused by my collar and think that, you know, something's different. So again, just line your pattern up with center back and the edges, pin it on so it's secure, and then go ahead and pin through your roll line through all layers so that you can mark it like you did on the other side. Now it's all pinned, I'll just mark the roll line on the other side. And again, I'm marking right underneath my pins. And once that's marked, go ahead and take out those pins that are going through your roll line and that are securing your pattern to the collar. And take it all off. Now what we'll do is, now my roll line is marked, we're going to connect all those markings to make one solid roll line. Okay. And now that that's marked, we're going to double up our thread and we're going to do a running basting stitch through the roll line. Just like we did on the lapel, we went through all layers right on the roll line. We'll do the same thing here on the undercollar. So double up your thread and do a running basting stitch through all layers of your roll line. Okay. Once you're finished, cut your thread. flip it and check it. Now we can see the roll line is marked, basted all the way through, both layers. And now what we're going to do, on both sides of that roll line, we're going to mark another line 1/8 of an inch away. So on the front of the jacket lapel, we did the same thing. We marked a line 1/8 of an inch away on both sides of it. Okay, so this first one is towards the neckline. And again, this line I'm marking is 1/8 away. And you're going to do that all the way across, from one side all the way to the other. There we go. Okay, now again, on the other side of the roll line, into the collar, mark a line also 1/8 away from the roll line. And mark that all the way across. Now we're going to continue marking these. These are pad stitching lines. So on the side closest to the neckline, we've marked one line that's 1/8 from the roll line. The next lines we're going to mark are 1/4 inch away. So the first one will be a 1/4 inch away from that 1/8 line that you already drew. And just keep drawing those lines until you get to the bottom. And again, they're all parallel to the neckline, or to the roll line. And again, you'll just be marking these lines a 1/4 inch from each other until you can't mark them anymore. You run out of collar, okay? And this is in the collar stand area, okay? So this is on the side of the roll line that's closest to the neckline. And remember to use like a colored pencil or chalk. Don't use marker or pen or something that will bleed through. Okay, we're just about all marked there. So I've marked all the lines on the neckline or a stand part of my collar, as you can see. Now I'm going to start marking lines into the fall section of the collar, okay? So remember, we've already marked one line 1/8 away from the roll line. So measuring from that line, that first line we've already marked, that's 1/8 away from the roll line, we're going to start marking lines 3/8 away from each other, okay? And same thing, just follow that same line. And they'll all be 3/8 away. Okay, here I'm marking my seam allowances before I go on, because these lines that we're marking, again, they're guides for where we're going to do our pad stitching, and we don't want to do any pad stitching in the seam allowance, okay? Because we're eventually going to cut away the hair canvas that's in the seam allowance. So let's just mark our seam allowance now and do that all the way around the collar. marking the seam allowance at the neckline too. Okay, once the seam allowance is done being marked, continue marking all those pad stitching lines. Again, we want these lines to be 3/8 from each other. And you're going to do that across the whole collar. And when you get to the seam allowances, you can stop because we don't want to pad stitch into the seam allowances. Alright, once all the lines are marked, notice up in the corner of the collar, they get smaller. Okay, so they're all 3/8 inches away. There's my roll line right here. Okay, these are all 1/4 inches away inside the stand from each other. And then outside, they're all 3/8 of an inch away. Okay, as you get closer to this point, they go back to 1/4. Alright, because we're going to do smaller stitches inside there, in this area. Alright, so now we're ready to do our pad stitching. It's going to be the same way we did it on our lapel. So that first line, that's 1/8 of an inch away from our roll line inside the collar stand. Okay, we'll start there. And we're going to do 1/8 inch stitches in there. Okay, so again, this is your pad stitching. It's that diagonal stitch. And you're going to go in on that first line, that's an 1/8 inch away from your roll line. And you're going to go through all layers and catch just a little bit of the wool. Alright. Now, when you're doing this, keep your finger underneath it. See how I'm holding it in my left hand? I kind of have the collar curled around it a little bit. That's how you want to do it. And that will help the collar start gaining its shape. So this will take a little while. Just go ahead and, again, you're just doing 1/8 of an inch stitches. And you're going to do this within that whole collar stand. You're going to go through each line that you drew. Okay. Now, this first line you're doing 1/8 of an inch stitches. Once you get to your other lines that are below this, you can start doing 1/4 inch stitches to 3/8 inch stitches. But this one you want to keep nice and tight. Okay, so here's all the pad stitching done within the collar stand. You can see how it's actually created a little bit of a roll line there. Okay, now we need to do all outside in the fall section of the collar. Okay, so it's on the other side. Here's my roll line. It'll be on the other side of that. So the first row will be against, remember we did another line that's an 1/8 inch away from the roll line. That's to the outside of the collar. Okay, and we'll do 1/8 inch stitches on that line as well. Okay. Alright, so here's the collar done. Now, that first line that was closest to the roll line, we did 1/8 inch stitches. All these other lines, we did 3/8 of an inch stitch. Okay, so we did smaller stitches here in the collar stand, and then larger stitches out in the fall section of the collar. Okay, but once we got into that outer corner of the collar, we went back to those smaller 1/8 inch, 1/4 inch stitches. But all these are 3/8 inch stitches in this section. Okay, it's just in this section here that we did the smaller 1/4 inch and 3/8 inch stitches. Okay, so now let's flip our collar over and see if any of the canvas is showing through the other side. Just a little bit here. So what we're going to do, if there's any canvas showing to the other side, then we want to trim it back. Here it's just a little smaller than the wool, and that's fine. But if there's anything, there's a little canvas here that's a little longer than the wool, we want to trim it down so it's the exact same, so the edges are even, okay? So trim it back anywhere, trim back the canvas anywhere it's not even with the wool. So there's a couple places here where it's not. Okay. Again, you can kind of see how I have a little bit of a roll line now. Now what I'm going to do is mark my seam allowance again. Alright, because my canvas has moved in some places, I need to remark my exact stitching line on here. Alright, mark this about a 1/2 inch, because what we'll do is we'll end up trimming this away to reduce our bulk. So just mark the whole collar again, because a lot of times when we do our pad stitching, things shift, the canvas shifts, and we want to make sure we're accurate where we trim away our seam allowance. We don't want to trim away too much, but we also don't want to trim away not enough. Okay, so the neckline we're going to leave, we're not going to trim anything out yet. Once you've marked your seam allowance, go ahead and trim the canvas only out of your seam allowance, okay? Don't trim it out of the neckline, just trim it out of the outer edge of the seam allowance, outer edge of the collar rather, okay? Okay, so while it's being trimmed out, we're going to get ready to steam our collar. So what you'll need is an iron that can produce steam, that has a button on it to produce steam, and a pressing ham, alright? So you're going to take your ham and you're going to wrap your collar around it so it's rolling right on your roll line, and you'll pin it around your ham. Now this collar is too long for this, so if you don't have a collar, try to use a dress form. Okay, wrap a bag of rice in a towel or something, whatever you can. But you want this to be rolled right on the roll line. And you'll pin it in place. Okay, so again, this collar is too big for this ham. So I will end up using a dress form to do it. Okay, but that's how you would have done it on a ham. So let me just take this dress form here and I will place it on here. Okay, make sure your center back is lined up with center back. Okay, if you don't have a ham and you have a dress form, you can just do it here, do it on your dress form. Notice I'm getting the roll line. I'm making sure my collar is rolling right on it. And now I'm going to pin it in place. So again, pulling this down so my roll line is right where the roll is. Okay, it's right there. And now I'll just pin it. And you only really need to pin it at the ends. And that's it. Okay. Again, make sure it's the roll line that's rolling on. And if it's not rolling around the roll line, adjust it so it is. Okay. So there's the collar. And it should naturally, because of the pad stitching and the pattern work and everything, it should pretty naturally want to roll there. Okay, you might have to manipulate it a little bit, but you can see my whole roll line that my collar is rolling over right on my roll line all the way around. Once you have it pinned in place, take your iron and use your steam button and just steam it like so. Okay, so just keep hitting the steam button and you're going to go around the whole thing, and this will help mold it and shape it in place. Okay, don't touch it with your iron, don't press it. You don't want to create a crease in that roll line. It wants to roll. It doesn't want to fold, it wants to roll. Okay, it doesn't want a crease in it. So you'll just use your steam really well, and then you can just let it sit there for a while. Okay, and let it sit for an hour or two. And here it is, all done. And you can see how it just molded right in shape. Okay, now if you're not doing anything with your collar, if you're not ready to sew it on, just leave it on the ham or on the dress form until you're ready to put it on. Don't leave it just like this, sitting on the table, because that won't be good for it. Put it somewhere where it can sit like it's on the form. And now your collar is ready to be attached to your jacket.